I'm almost there. Okay, yeah. Are we starting?
Yeah, I make it 1:45. So I think we're ready to start. So I'm going to do a very quick introduction, but just to say hi and welcome to our panel members, Marilyn, Sae, Nenna, Alice, and Alison. And I'll hand over to you, Alice.
Great, thank you, Darren, and hi everyone. It's been such a great conference so far. I really enjoyed yesterday. I am not sort of leading this session, but I will be having a facilitation role, a sort of chair if you like, but it's a round table, so we're all going to be feeding in different ways. And as you can see from the title slide, it's called Changing the Landscape, a roundtable discussion on D/colonial problematic terms that we're going to talk about, dimensions of LIS, Library and Information Studies praxis. We're all just going to introduce ourselves briefly now, starting with Marilyn.
Thank you, Alice, and hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Sorry I couldn't join yesterday's sessions, but hopefully I'll be able to catch up on those recordings when they're available. So my name is Marilyn Clarke. I am currently the head of the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies Library, School of Advanced Study, University of London. And I've previously worked at Goldsmiths, Imperial and Senate House Libraries, been in libraries for 30 plus years. Yeah, it's been a journey. The journey continues, of course. A lot of my work in the recent years is focused on social justice. I think I've always been an activist from day one, really. And I continue that work in my professional career as well. Personal is the political is personal, personal is political, professional. It's all wrapped up in the same thing, can't divorce one from the other. Um, I, I'm a speaker. I've been invited to conferences to talk about some of the work that I've done in libraries, in particular my work at Goldsmiths as part of the Liberate Our Library initiative. I'm sure I'll touch on that a bit more during the course of the roundtable. I've also sat on the SCONAL Executive Board for a 4-year term, and recently finished working with the Bodleian Libraries on their We Are Our History board, looking at their links, colonial links in their collections, services, history, etc. So very much part of that conversation. I'm also equally passionate about what the professional looks like, the lack of Black leaders, particularly in the profession, and Black staff across the board, global majority staff. So I've done work on that and representations and pathways into the profession, in particular with the introduction of positive action graduate traineeships, both at my current institution and previously at Goldsmiths. I will leave it there. Thank you.
Sae, I think you're next.
Yes, all right. My name is Sae Matsuno. Good to see you, everyone. I'm also so glad to be here. I was a student at University College London, UCL, Library and Information Studies until very recently. So I graduated only last year. I stayed in the program for 6 years. So that was a really long time to complete my degree. I worked as an academic librarian in University of Northampton, and Darren Flynn was my former line manager, and Alison Hicks here, she used to be my supervisor. I worked with Marilyn, Alice, and Nenna in different capacities, and it's a great moment for all of us to be in the space to talk about decolonization in libraries. So thank you for all to come here and listen to our narratives. currently, I work at King's College London in an open research team, and I'm starting to explore what it means to be part of a decolonization within that team. And it's again a new start to look into new possibilities. So I'm hoping to use this opportunity, this panel discussion, roundtable conversation, to take new steps in this endeavor. Very happy to be here.
I'm up next. Hi, my name is Nenna Orie Chuku. As already said on the slide, I'm a teaching and research assistant in the department. I also completed my PhD and my master's in the department as well. Thank you so much to the organisers of the conference. It's no small feat putting something like this together. I also want to say thank you to those who are attending, as well as Alison, Sae, and Alice for inviting me on to this conversation about this. My research examines information, knowledge, and communication design in migration, as well as contemporary journaling context as well. My thesis proposed the use of an information space of coloniality to examine the implications of a phenomenon touched by a colonial encounter. In my thesis case, I examined in a migration context, looking at Sierra movement to and from England and unpacking the concept of migration information in it. I look forward to the discussion and hearing others' thoughts about the topics that we share.
Thank you, Nenna, Sae, Marilyn. I'm so pleased to be sharing this conversation with you and with Alison. I'll be brief about myself. Alice Corble, pronouns she, her. I have started working in UCL Department of Information Studies in a new role as a lecturer this October just passed. I'd done a little bit of sessional teaching with them the previous year as well. And so I'm teaching on the Library and Information Studies program, but I've also brought with me a research project that I started in my previous employer, which was University of Sussex. That's a Lever Hume Early Career Fellowship that it's not easy to explain in a sentence, but it's very much about the role of libraries in actual processes of decolonization in the Caribbean context, particularly with academic libraries, and the kind of transnational relationships between those contexts and that of academic librarianship in the UK in University of Sussex and London as well. So it's a kind of post-colonial, decolonial landscape of knowledge justice struggles, let's say, for a shorthand. I also position myself as a scholar, activist, educator. I've done lots of work in community settings. I've worked like professionally and as a kind of community activist in libraries for about 15 years, mainly public and academic libraries. And I've also been very rooted in various anti-racist and anti-colonial activist groupings. I was involved with Alison and Marilyn and others, including Naomi Smith, who was an alumni from UCL, and possibly others here. I haven't seen the audience, in a collective called the Critical Race Theory Collective. I've since stepped back from that because I've got too much on my plate. But yeah, that's a little bit about me. And Alison is next.
Thanks, Alice, and everyone. Hi, everybody. I'm Alison Hicks. I'm an information literacy researcher and scholar based at UCL. I've worked as a librarian for about 10 years in academic and special library sectors, and then moved over to this lecturer role about almost 8 years ago now. I've had many different roles at UCL. Most recently, I was a program director of the Library and Information Studies program. I'm now back to just being a normal lecturer, which is quite exciting also. But I also have a lot of responsibility for the PhD students in our department, which I really enjoy too. In my research, I'm old enough that I'm part of the early wave of critical information literacy back in the 2000s. So I was quite involved with that when I was a librarian, especially thinking about language and intercultural aspects of critical information literacy. More recently, my research is focusing on questions of risk and transition and information literacy, so how risk is informed in everyday life. And then most recently, I've been studying book banning and censorship, which is another fascinating area too. Yeah, so that's kind of a little bit about me, but I'm also really excited about critical education for LIS students as well. That's another big passion of mine. So as you can tell, we're obviously all speakers on this panel are very connected through UCL. That was how we've all got to know each other. And we thought that that would be a really interesting sort of dynamic to bring to this panel, with obviously we've had students, we've had sessional lecturers, teaching assistants, permanent lecturers. We thought that would provide quite an interesting context to explore decolonial praxis in LIS, but we are interpreting that quite broadly. So thinking about teaching and research as well as other aspects of librarianship. We also want to make clear that we are not speaking for our employer. We also really want to make clear that this is not a like patting ourselves on the back, aren't we doing great at UCL? This is a very much a critical interrogation of work that we're all involved with, and that's going to be the focus of the panel today. So yeah, I think that's about all. If you want to go to the next slide, Alice. Perfect. So just quickly to give you an overview of how this panel is going to function this afternoon. So first of all, Alice is going to provide some really helpful framing for the panel. So talking a bit about what we mean by how we understand decolonial theory and how it's applied within library and information studies. And there's some epic pictures of monsters coming up. And then we'll move on to the thematic roundtable discussion, where this is going to be a bit more exciting because we don't really know what anyone else is saying. So that adds an extra layer of joy or fear. But we've got three major topics. We're going to be talking about power, being, and knowledge. And the reason for those three will become clear when you see Alice's slides in a minute. So one of us is going to open each of those sections, and then the rest of the panelists will join in with contributions or responses as the movement, as we feel fit. Then we'll end aiming to wrap up 10 minutes. I really appreciate Michelle's focus on timekeeping, so we will stick with that and wrap up 10 minutes before the end for any discussion or Q&A. Just very quickly for Zoom etiquette, we really encourage you to either use the Q&A box or the chat bar during our talks if you wanted to share resource, things that have sort of struck you, things you thought that the rest of the attendees might like to know about. At the end, we'll have an opportunity to ask questions verbally as well as written questions. We know from yesterday that the chat can get quite busy. So if you could put a Q next to your question, if you have a specific question, that would be really helpful for them to help us prioritize and identify those later in the Q&A section. Otherwise, it's just fine to have a normal quick comment. We are recording the session, but as we don't quite know how it's going to go, and we're not sure what topics we're actually going to cover, we want to review it before we decide whether it will be published to YouTube. So we'll make a decision about that after the session. So I think that's all the housekeeping, and I'll pass back over to Alice.
Thanks so much, Alison. Yeah, and I think with the Zoom thing, the other sessions may not have had a Q&A box. So if you're not used to that, I think it's down on the bottom right. Well, it's for me anyway. And I will be monitoring that for the Q&A part at the end. And Darren and Michelle will help out if I'm missing things in the chat. If that's all right. Thank you, Darren and Michelle. All right, so we're already running over a little bit our planned schedule. So I'm going to try and cover some theoretical framing in a far too fast time frame. I will try and be accessible, but if you're not catching it all, it's it's quite dense theory stuff. That you have access to the slides there, where all the other slides are, and all the links to the papers are in the slides as well. So bear with me, I'm just lining up so I can see my notes properly. Got a lot of things on this screen. Yeah, we've called this a roundtable discussion on sort of the D/colonial dimensions of LIS practice. And we thought it was important before we kind of get into the discussion on that we theoretically ground it in a long lineage of the liberation scholars and activists who have defined these theoretical terms there are many, but there's a big tradition of it in Latin America and in South Africa in particular. So we're just going to touch briefly on that here in this framing section. And in particular, starting with the work of Aníbal Quijano, apologies for my poor pronunciation, who, this is a collected book on the left here of his essays that have been produced over many decades. He is a Peruvian sociologist whose body of work really made a lot of groundbreaking theory in what's known as dependency theory in the 60s and 70s. There's lots of debates on historiography, modernity, culture, and identity in the 80s. And then in around about the 90s, very importantly for our discussion, is his development of sort of decolonial theory, and particularly his articulation of the coloniality of power, which has since been mobilized through many different theoretical traditions. So he conceptualized coloniality as a multi-dimensional term, and this is something that is distinct conceptually from what's broadly called colonialism or imperialism. So coloniality covers the dimensions of all the intersecting kind of experiences, but with race as its central organizational or classificatory principle, if you like. So it's something that incorporates all spheres of social existence, labor relations, intersubjective relations, family, gender, sex, authority, etc. Stuff that we're often thinking about through lenses of like intersectionality and things like that now. But it's really important to know the theoretical and material roots of these struggles and theories back in the late 20th century. So his work and others in Latin America and Caribbean has influenced many other scholars, particularly in the Southern African context. And notably for our discussion here is the work of Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni, again, apologies for my pronunciation, who has written extensively on this in the African context. So Ndlovu-Gatsheni has applied a lot of this Latin American theory to the impact of globalization and neo-colonial nationalism in the decolonial African contexts. And these scholars are the basis of the paper I'm going to come to in a moment by Library and Information Studies scholars at the University of Sheffield. But before we do that, I just want a couple of images to try and illustrate these concepts a bit more clearly. Starting with this monster, riffing off the monster theme from yesterday's keynote. This is not such a joyful monster, I'm afraid. It is the colonial matrix monster. This image is credited to Jairo Funes Flores. Thank you, Alison, for helping me with that. He's a brilliant contemporary scholar of decoloniality who draws on Quijano's work a lot, and he's translated some of it as well. So I'm just going to read out this quote from the translation of Quijano, which says, colonial relations of power did not only leave indelible marks in the areas of race, sexuality, knowledge, and the economy, but also on the general understanding of being. This refers to the effects of coloniality in people's lived experience and in their mind and perceptions of themselves. That's paraphrasing Marilyn Clarke. The concept relates to issues of human ontology, how we see and perceive ourselves. So I've just realized that I've read out a slightly different quote to the one on the slide. Apologies, my notes got a bit mixed up there. But they're essentially saying the same thing. And you can access that afterwards. Sorry for that. So here hopefully is a little bit more clearly broken down those three concepts of power, being, and knowledge. I'm not going to read them all out because we're already over time. But I will highlight here this Venn diagram that perhaps is a little bit more accessible of how these three dimensions intersect. And they weren't the only facets of that monster you saw before, but we're just going to focus on these three today. And the point of decolonial processes of thinking and practice is to try and de-link how these facets of colonial power are operating. So power being all linked to modernity and the kind of master-slave, inferior-superior dynamics around race and exploitation and extraction of land and life, etc. Basically, white supremacy, racial capitalism, patriarchy, etc. Something that is alarmingly prescient in most of the news at the moment. And that, of course, then impacts on being and on knowledge. So being is how we experience things, or different people experience this differently through dehumanization, racism, sexism, transphobia, ableism, classism, and all the other isms. And that then, of course, translates into how we produce and organize knowledge in Eurocentric and racist hierarchical ways, and erase and do violence to so many indigenous knowledges and cultures. Sorry, this is not joyful stuff, but we are going to hopefully get to some areas of liberation and resistance that we can think about. So I know that I'm running over time now again, but this final diagram is from the other paper I mentioned from the scholars at Sheffield, from their paper, A Holistic Decolonial Lens for Library and Information Studies. So how can we think about applying this complex theory and overwhelming context of the world to the work that we do in library and information fields? So they have this helpful way of translating the theory and the concepts into areas of practice in our field. So the power dimension, if we want to challenge that in decolonial ways and do this delinking work, we need to look at how we are committed to social justice and anti-racism in everything that we do in our work, whether it's research, teaching, or librarianship, practice, leadership, etc. Marilyn's going to kick off on that topic in a moment. And then they argue that, sorry, this is Jimenez, Vanini, and Cox. Sorry, I didn't actually name them. They argue that around the being dimension of othering and marginalization, what we need to adopt. I mean, when we say we, they're coming from the position, obviously, of the global north, you know, that never mind their own individual identities, they're in an established university in England, and they want to look at the impact of that on their field through their own reflexivity and positionality. And then with knowledge, it's about engagement with epistemic decolonization and a pluriversal, you know, a multitude of knowledges rather than sort of monocultural Western approach. That was a lot of words and theory, and I'm sorry I haven't done it justice and I've run over time, but I hope it was helpful for those of you who are less familiar with this kind of work and something to refer back to. And it's essentially the sort of theoretical jumping off point for how the discussion is going to unfold now with these three dimensions. Before I hand over to that, has anyone got any immediate questions, or that they couldn't hear me, or is everything sort of flowing okay? Are you ready for me to move on? Sorry, I haven't been looking at the chat.
I think we're good, Alice.
We're good. Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to hand over now to Marilyn to say a few words to sort of get the panel going on this theme of power, big juicy one. And I'm going to try and time us and recalculate how much time we've got. I might need your help, Darren. You know, I am a little time blind with my ADHD, so I'll try and do my best and move us on. Thank you. Over to you, Marilyn.
Thank you so much, Alice, for introducing our roundtable session. And so I'm going to kick off briefly on the on the theme of power. What do we mean in this context? We're talking about institutional power. What local, national, global power dynamics govern our decision-making when it comes to library collections, spaces, systems, services, and policies, and whose interests do we serve? We're looking at privilege and neutrality. Who has privilege? What do people do with that privilege in the library and information field? And how does that privilege manifest itself in the whiteness of the profession as well? And also we're looking at structural biases in our funding models, our partnerships, our publishing models, etc. And how are these reinforcing colonial hierarchies? I thought if I wanted to start with sharing a letter or parts of a letter that I came across yesterday from a Black professor in the United States who has resigned from some boards that she sits on, the National Science Foundation and the Library of Congress, in light of, I'm sure you all know that the Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden, was fired by the Trump administration. Similarly, the Register of Copyrights, Shira Perlmutter, similarly fired. And Alondra Nelson wrote a contribution in Time magazine, and she is a professor at the Institute of Advanced Study in the US. She's an author, policy advisor, and a researcher. And she, as I said, has resigned from the National Science Board and the Library of Congress Scholars Council. And I was reading her resignation letter, and it really just made me think, gosh, you know, there's so much happening in the wider world, and you know, we could be here all day talking about all of that, all the injustice around us at the moment. But I just thought I'd share some of the lines of her resignation letter, because it really resonated with me in terms of looking at what we're talking about on this roundtable. So, to quote, "All of this is threatened by this creeping normalization of authoritarian approaches to knowledge management and academic freedom. The National Science Board has not been disbanded like so many other statutory established independent agencies in the federal government, but preservation of form provides little consolation when function has been strategically neutralized, mirroring the backsliding that scholars have thoroughly documented, maintaining legitimacy for institutions that no longer honor their founding purposes. This hollowing out is not just about governance in the abstract, it has material consequences for which research questions get asked, which data sets get produced, which knowledge gets produced, and which perspectives shape our understanding of pressing societal challenges. It has consequences for the integrity of knowledge itself." I'm going to stop there. I was going to quote a bit more from that, but I'm going to try and post that in the chat at some point during the roundtable. But for me, it really spoke to not only the fact that somebody in her position felt she had to resign, but not because she's stepping away from the work, but she had to resign so she can use her power in another way, in other ways, use her voice in other ways, because the reason why she was on those boards is now being taken away. And for her, it's like, well, I'm not going to sit here and pretend this is not happening. It is happening and it's real, but how can I then shift and make my voice known in other ways but still supporting these important institutions? So I just wanted to open with that. And also myself as a Black leader in the library and information profession, but one of very few still. We're not seeing, you know, the numbers increasing. They've increased very slightly, but that's another. I'm in a position of power, but sometimes I feel powerless still in this position. So it's not like I can make changes in my current institution. Yes, I've got power to do that, but I don't have, you know, power in many spaces within the institution. And to some degree, you know, it's looking at changing those systems. It's looking at the systemic racism that we see across the board in higher education institutions in particular. So I'm just really wanting to kind of just open up this theme of power with my colleagues here, but also emphasizing that it feels like a lonely place sometimes to be a Black leader in academic libraries in higher education in the UK. But I'm really, really empowered by things like this conference, like CALC conference, where you can have these open, very honest conversations and exchanges. So I'm going to ask my colleagues to chip in here before we run over time.
I think we're okay. That was like 4 minutes, Marilyn. So thank you. And I'm really glad you shared that letter. I was reading that just this morning, and wanted to talk to you about it. So yeah, I encourage everyone to read. Someone did share it in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
So my fellow interlocutors, who feels moved to speak back to power?
I will first start. Thank you, Marilyn. As always, the words you utter, they have power. It just evokes so many positive emotions in me, and I think for the theme you raised, there were just really interesting point about deeply thinking about power to oppress, but you also talked about power to liberate. So to strategize, to organize, and to mobilize, we should be always paying attention to these different types of power. And you just need to, I just felt like continuing to focus on, keeping the integrity when we think about power. So it's a little bit vague, but I think other co-presenters can also respond. So that's my initial response. Thank you so much, Marilyn.
Thank you, Sae.
Thank you, Marilyn. What I thought of when you mentioned the letter and the resignation is also in the UK context, the general reception of what we see as public libraries and the underfunding nature of it, as it not having this big integral role in how a nation perceives itself, and the role of libraries in more general historically as form of nation building tools. So whilst we in the UK context, and not, I can't say North America because I'm not situated there, I do not operate there. But whilst we have a kind of reduction to the role and the funding towards in the public library sector, we also have that balance of wanting to control it, still wanting to operate in this dynamic, even though it's not seen in our contemporary ways as much as an integral force, and the difficulties of balancing that, of countering that when you are ultimately siloed, whether you have been a racialized, minoritized other, or also if you yourself in your work and activities are seeking to counter the forces that continue to operate on this coloniality binary of needing the oppression in order for modernity to exist, and recognizing we haven't arrived at a moment whereby we've acknowledged that the now is so much dependent of the oppressive force of our before. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Nenna. I'm going to come back right down to earth because my reflections are a lot more practical. I love Nenna's theoretical view, though, and linking it to public libraries. Yeah, when I really appreciated your comments, Marilyn, about it being quite a lonely space as a leader and thinking about power in that sense. And I ended up in a position where I took on the program director role suddenly due to some staff illness. And that was kind of a weird position because I suddenly did have a bit of power. I'd just normally just been a normal librarian for a long time. And that was kind of weird to think about that. And one thing that helped me to think about how to deal with that, how to manage that, was I was reminded of a colleague, a racially minoritized colleague, who asked for funding to go to a conference related to racially minoritized librarians. And my administration at the time, the library leaders, took like a month to decide, and they finally got back to him and like, yeah, you can have the money, you can go. And my colleague turned them down, and he was kind of like, screw you, you took a month to get back to me. If this is what you really want to do, if you want to be aligned with decolonial work, you should have, this is what you should be doing. You shouldn't be thinking twice about funding that. And so I found that a really useful way to think about how to interpret my power. The little power I had, honestly, it's not very much at all, but the little power I had was thinking about that, my colleague, and how much I learned from him, that if we want to align ourselves as a critical librarian as whatever we're thinking, however we're aligning ourselves, and it's that whatever it takes has to be the approach we use, whether it's working with students, supporting students, or anything else we're doing in our teaching and learning as well. So that was kind of my reflection on power and how we deal with that in the library setting.
Thank you all. Did you, Nenna, did I get a sense you wanted to say something back, or was that no? No, okay. No worries. No, that's good, because that was exactly 10 minutes, which is what we planned, even though I got us behind before that. So it will all work out, I'm sure. But I think that last point about bringing us back down to earth through, like, what are the material financial things you can do, because power is obviously capital as well. It's resources. It you know, coloniality works through the capital industrial complex as well. So sometimes you've got to turn the logic back on itself and find, even if it's micro ways of re-extracting and redistributing. Doesn't always work, but we must try. All right, moving on to being. Hang on, I've lost my slide functionality. I will get there. I'm going to hand over to you now, Sae, while I figure out how to move the slides on. Apologies, I've got in a muddle.
That's all right. So for this category being, I will start by sharing my memory, a moment of realization at the age of 14 in Japan. So that's where I originally come from. And it's in the late 1980s. So one day, my favorite math tutor wrote two names on the blackboard, one Korean and the other Japanese. And that prompted many questions in my head. Like, why does he have two names? Why is he saying he needs a bit of courage to talk about this Korean name? Why have there been generations of Korean people living in Japan using Japanese names? And why do I know so little about these things? And why have I not been taught about these things in school? And his message was clear. He wanted us well-meaning but ignorant teenagers to start understanding our colonizer positionality, bringing this realization, he is here because we were there. And I can see many of the colonial matrix elements of power, being, and knowledge in the basic questions I asked to myself as a young person. However, it was after 2019, 30 years later, that I really started to look into the themes of colonialism and decolonization. And it was during the time when I started to grapple with questions around the coloniality of being a librarian. And I was struggling to enter the sector known to be predominantly white. So from 2018 to 2024, I was a student at the UCL Library and Information Studies and participated in some of the decolonizing initiatives within UK libraries. So I've got the link, which I'm going to pop into the chat. So the first one is a video I collaborated with Alison and Marilyn. The other one's an open access paper about the future, the past, present, and future of LIS education. And also the link to my dissertation excerpt, which I will be talking tomorrow during this CALC session. I'm going to have a presentation supported by Alice. So currently I'm working at King's College London, one of the larger academic libraries in the UK. And I'm based at its main library, the Morn Library. So our library building was converted in the early 2000s from the 19th century public record office building. And it was a huge archive where papers of, for example, British Colonial Office, Foreign Office, Slave Trade and African Department, and War and Colonial Department were housed. So there are some original architectural structures and decorations left in the current building. Whenever I walk around this space, I just have to feel the weight of British Empire. And I usually feel a bit helpless and discouraged, thinking how little I can do to resist the legacies of entangled empires, including my own, not just the British Empire. But whenever I feel a bit down, I come back to the resources on decolonial thinking and doing, which I've recently found. So one of them is Marilyn's Change in Light video, and another one is Dolov Gacheni's interview, very skillfully edited summaries of his ideas and thoughts. So I'm going to put those links also in the chat. There you go. Yeah, Marilyn, the film where you were featured, I just noticed that it's now on Vimeo, so everyone can watch it. So finally, to open up this conversation to my co-presenters, I'd like to say that from the life journey I have taken, I came to believe it is the decoloniality of doing that we constantly and continuously develop that will help us to resist the coloniality of being. So, well, over to my co-presenters to respond.
Thank you, Sae. Mate, it's always beautiful to listen to you. I love how you reflect, and it's always, yeah, always moves me. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for highlighting the film that well, I can't say I made it, a filmmaker who was a practitioner in residence at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies with us in 2023, called Anna MacDonald. She's a scholar at dance and movement scholar at University of the Arts, London. She joined us as a practitioner in residence with a completely open remit as to what she wanted to do with that. And it was through sharing conversations on some of the work that I wanted to do in the library around looking at the collections, decolonizing the collections, not only how they're described, but where they're positioned, where particular parts of the collection sit. And it was through these discussions that she eventually, Anna is also a filmmaker, sorry, I should have mentioned that as well, but she said, you know, what about making a short film about this work? And that is now available on our website and via Vimeo, as Sae outlined just now. But it looks at the collection that I encountered when I joined the Institute in September 2022, and particular parts of the collection being the Commonwealth collections jurisdictions were housed in the lower ground floor in the basement bowels of the building, very far away from the rest of the collection, which was on the 3rd and 4th floors, which were covering the UK and Europe, international law, etc. And it was really stark to me and quite, yeah, somatically, it was really traumatic to see that. And I thought, you know, why is it like this? It's 2022, the British Empire is, you know, in the last, you know, ended in the last century, yet there were descriptions for some parts of the collection, that collection, like British West Indies. And, you know, so the classification system was old and outdated, and the positioning of the collection needed to be tackled. So some of that work is, you know, highlighted in the film Changes in Light. I should probably shut up because we're probably running out of time.
Thank you, Marilyn and Sae. I think there was so much more to say there. We are we do want to make sure we have enough time for questions, but that was a perfect segue to the last category on knowledge. And Nenna, I would love to hand over to you to say a few words about that, but I'm afraid if we want questions, we might only have 5 minutes for knowledge, sorry.
No worries, no worries. So yeah, when thinking about knowledge, we've alluded to this about the whole conversation, is that role of decolonial or decolonization when it comes to trying to address the power imbalances, the silences, the continuities of colonial thinking in, as in like from my experience doing the managing collections module, teaching about collections management, thinking about cataloging and such. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what does it mean to be decolonial if you're working, in our case, in a metropole, a place that is a colonizer, as well as those who are working in settler nations. What does it mean to be decolonial? And when I look at the publications and the guidances, a lot of it does come from North America, Australia. You have this very living impact of colonialism when it comes to Indigenous communities. But then I also start to think about what does that mean for those who are not working in those environments, so those who are working in the metropole. What does it mean to be decolonial, being on the diversity of adding stuff to our collections? What does it mean then to think about Indigenous ways of thinking when it comes to diasporic groups and how their practices, whether they can truly be reflected in librarianships and in library context? And that when it comes back to that being and power element of coloniality, how whether it will ever mesh, whether there will always be a friction between those who are doing Indigenous ways of thinking and how it can't ultimately be reflected or contained within an institution of the library. But yeah, this is my thought.
Thank you, Nenna. I didn't want to rush you. If you do have more to say, please do. But
No, yes,
yeah, we've got like 4 minutes for everyone to feed in on knowledge. Obviously, that's not enough time. But who feels like speaking next?
I can talk a little bit about, again, I'm going to go pretty practical. I think the challenges of information literacy, that's my research area. I find that's quite a funny, tricky area to deal with. I find it sometimes quite a depressing area, I have to say. I'm going to try and be really honest here, because there has been a fair amount of research trying to really criticize and critique and get to the nub of what information literacy is, but that's still really, it's not really very broadly understood, I wouldn't say, at the moment. There's been a lot of research on changing pedagogy and how we teach, and thinking that's brilliant to see that, but I don't see that same approach to how we think about embodiment, say in information literacy, how information literacy is embodied or how it's social. And I think that's a really important aspect of colonial work that we're maybe not quite doing in libraries. And I use some critical discourse analysis techniques to look at the really implicit sort of ways in which we other students within our professional guidelines and frameworks. And that was kind of a bit of a low point to me. So I guess that's, again, a bit depressing, but I think it's just really important that we use a variety of different methods to understand all the very insidious ways in which we are suppressing ways of knowing from our communities, especially how they use communities use information. I think there's so many insidious ways, and it's important we sort of focus on that and push back against that sort of cheerleader approach, which I really struggle with, particularly for information literacy. So yeah, that's another example from me.
Can I just come back with what Alison was saying? Thank you. One of the things I really contend with a lot when it comes to the LIS world and the institutions associated to it is whether it can. So whilst there's a lot of well-meaning elements to it and a lot of decades work gone towards it, and the disparity of like a wave of funding for an activity, and then it's cool, we've done it, tick box, and then it all quiets again. So sometimes I do feel like whether, even though there's well-meaning intentions, the actual general capacity and desire to have that really shift and change, I'm of a cynical nature, and I think it's still going to be quite individualized when it comes to having pockets of illumination or pockets of justice occur in an institution that, or in a practice that's increasingly not really seen and not trying to justify its usages in the library context, of like footfall, if our metrics are geared to something that doesn't really explain what we're discussing about knowledge is and what is erased, what is silence. I don't like what the impetus then to then change it in a grander scheme. I don't know. And this is quite cynical, so sorry. It's not like the boost of optimism. That's probably.
Thank you, Nenna. I think I would love to hear more from you all, but I think there's already 3 questions so we should probably move on to that. But just to try and, I was going to try and synthesize and summarize, but that feels quite hard to do and there isn't enough time. But just to jump off that last point about it can feel like impossible or too challenging. Yes, it can. And I hold on to a couple of quotes that sustain me with that. One is, I might be misquoting this slightly, I love the work of Foluke Adebisi, sorry if that's pronounced wrong, professor of law studies, an amazing decolonial theorist. She says, decolonization is impossible, but we must make her possible. And then another quote from Antonio Gramsci is something like, we have pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And that's a tension I think we need to hold productively together. And for me, the only way to do this work, and for all of us, I think, is to find the collective ways. You can't do it on your own. You're not going to decolonize the university. That's just not going to happen. But you can try and rearrange it and resist it and dismantle it and make it less colonially insidious. So yeah, I will stop rambling about that and try and read some of these questions. I'm not sure who was first because there's 2 in the Q&A. Oh no, oh my gosh, there's 4 in the Q&A, and I think there was 1 in the chat. The chat one might have been first. I'm not sure. Sorry. I will find the chat one before I lose it, and then I'll go to the Q&A one. So the chat one was from Sally, thank you. How do we navigate the ways in which institutions, workplaces, professional bodies, etc., co-opt the language of decolonization or equity, diversity, and inclusion in ways that dilute or depoliticize or defang them? I like that term. Do we join and challenge, or do we opt out, and what? Yeah, big question, important one. Anyone feel like having a go at that one? We're going to have to be fairly brief to get through the others as well. So,
I mean, I'd say like initially a lot of eye rolling. That also helps me to feel better when I come across that. I think it depends on partly is how you are. Some things, you can respond to, and you can sort of gain that a bit of an identity as a bit of a killjoy because you're constantly coming back to this, like challenging and critiquing ideas. But other times that can also get too much as well. That's a lot of emotional labor doing that. So I think that's also really important to bear in mind. Marilyn, I saw you turned off your camera, microphone.
Yeah, that whole thing around, it being exhausting, and if you're the only voice, and if you're seen, then you're seen to be this kind of a bit of a, dare I say, troublemaker. But I always like to think of John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, and he spoke of good trouble. So make good trouble. We're going to do something. We're not going to sit back and do nothing. We're going to do something. So I mean, as much as there's a lot of pushback, you have to just take the power that we were talking about, at the beginning, and use it where you can. I mean, it's sometimes, change is, extremely slow in this sector. But there are more and more voices. I'm hearing more and more voices, speaking out and trying to get good work done. But it's the thing that frustrates me is it's incredibly slow to change. And yeah, there's not enough people in positions of leadership, using that to make change.
Definitely. You're an amazing example of that, Marilyn. And I think so many other leaders can learn from you, and I hope follow your example as well. I think I've definitely been a troublemaker everywhere I've worked, and hopefully I'll manage to keep this job. But yeah, I mean, as a white woman in the field of librarianship that's dominated by white women, I feel an extra responsibility to be a troublemaker. Otherwise, you know, we've got to help shift it from that positionality as well in coalition. But anyway, questions. Okay, I don't know.
Just to add, because I did mention about the co-option of language, and
Yes.
I think that we had these discussions in the classroom setting as well about how and when we used to use the idea of woke, and we wanted to talk about woke in the class. What does that then mean? If it's been co-opted in a way that is completely derived from additional attentions, and we struggled in other discussions to think about how in an experience of a library, so contending with you as a librarian or you as a researcher institution, but then also you providing a service that should help people to navigate this language, this usages. And we didn't have an absolute thing around whether we use, in the case of, I think it was UCL, using websites and stuff to think about origin and terminologies and how it's co-opted. And whilst that's ultimately an additional labor to oneself, it's also trying to have something there in the ether, so it's just not completely washed out from its context.
For sure, yeah, thank you for picking up on that, Nenna. I could say so much about that, but we do not have time. I'm trying to think of how we can combine any of these questions, but while I think of that, there is a specific question for Alison that about finding infolit depressing. And Zoe says, love infolit, but feel the same way sometimes when dealing with mis and disinformation, and wanted to ask what you meant by the cheerleader approach to information literacy.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe. Maybe we need a little depressed IL people club. I don't know. So what I mean, so that cheerleader reference came from some work that my colleague Rebecca Noon and I have been doing, and actually related to misinformation, funnily enough. So we critically analysed what themes or what topics we noticed in misinformation research, misinformation lesson plans, misinformation web pages, etc., that librarians have been teaching. And we found it was really interesting the themes, the predominant themes were this idea of war, battle, combat. There are a lot of military themes in that focus on misinformation lesson plans, but also the cheerleader, like let's make lemonade from these lemons, and you know, this is all really great, it's even really hard work, but it's such a good opportunity for the library, that sort of cheerleader approach. And we found that both of those narratives is really problematic because it really affects the work that we're expecting librarians to do, the pressure we're putting on them. And also the emotional draining aspect of that as well. So yeah, I'll put a link to that research. It's going to be presented 2 weeks' time, so you just had a sneak preview. But yeah, that's what I meant by the cheerleader approach. And I think sometimes that, like, information literacy is so great, we need to keep pushing it, and everyone's going to get it. It's so important, and you know, I find that a lot sometimes. I just want to be critical sometimes. So I think that's what I meant.
Thank you, Alison. So there's 2 questions that could be semi-combined, I think, about the tension between individual responsibility versus institutional, departmental responsibility and action, and you know how challenging that can be. But and to add to that, Nancy asked about relating to the problem about funding. As Nenna said, this is also true in international aid. Nancy did a very good presentation on this yesterday. So how can we try and do this work without institutional support? How do we get user and community buy-in when the university context there's so much turnover? Yeah, it's hard to answer that in 2 minutes, but does anyone want to chip in on that, on those combined points? I mean, while you're thinking, I, in my own practice, I think, you know, it's like Marilyn said, it's slow, and you know, getting institutions to do things that they don't already have to or want to do is incredibly hard. But you have to then work outside the boundaries of the institution as well. You have to put in your work and labor it yourself, and you've got to think about what capacity you have to do that, to build relationships inside and outside, to do that kind of collective fugitive work, as it can sometimes be called. But yeah, there's no easy answer to that. Does anyone else have any thoughts?
Yeah, only just, say, Alice, it's about this, isn't it? It's about finding community. Where can you have these conversations? Where can you do this work? Finding those people, who are talking the same language as you. Because sometimes, within your job, within the institution, there aren't those people there. Not to the degree that you need them, or to the degree that you need that support when you're, even though they can't enact change, within your institution, but they can be a source of support. And somebody who could, it's so important to have people you can have these conversations with if you can't have them within your institution. So I think that's where, working with you all and having spaces like this is so important, to do that and have these outlets.
And I just want to add, for the individual journeys, it's going to be a lifelong one. And that realization is not depressing, it's a blessing. So 30 something years, from this moment, this interaction with my Korean teacher, my motivation has been refreshed every day. And I really like the way Marilyn put it, do something, just, doing nothing is not an option. So it's not to be harsh on yourself. Taking care of yourself can be a form of resistance. Don't you think so, everyone?
Yeah, absolutely.
And just to say, Sae, I think working with Sae has been very refreshing and positive for me. Sae and I have a little 2-person book club, and which has been amazing. And yeah, I really appreciate being able to work with you on that, Sae. It's the allyship is really valuable. You're right.
Thank you all. Nenna, did you want to have any last words? No pressure. No pressure.
Good. My last word is more like, from working with authors who are children authors who are trying their best to get their books and talking to the public about it. They recognize that there's a lack of funding in public libraries to get them in. So for them, trying to work more as a collective across different industries to say, okay, well, you're a trade or publisher, how can I use your resources to get in? So thinking about a collective and community beyond the librarians or the library that you're working with, which takes more effort, but there's a lot of joy in meeting authors and people who are working at community publishing areas that can maybe give some scaffolding and support in different ways.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to get told we've got to stop in a minute, but there's some really great comments in the chat, and I'm sorry that I didn't get to all the questions, every single question in the Q&A. I'm really happy to follow up with anyone by email. You can, I'm just a.corble@ucl.ac.uk. Nenna, there's some particularly good comments about reinforcing a lot of the points you've said. So have a look at, try and save the chat. I will try and save the chat as well.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. Someone has actually volunteered to collate all the links in the chat, and we'll be sending it to us, and then we'll put it on the website with your slides. So, yeah, thank you so much to all of the panel. I apologise, I do have to wrap up now to make sure everyone gets a break, and then we can start the next session on time. But yeah, that was a great session. Thank you so much to all of the panel, and I'm sure that you'll be able to see in the chat. Everyone's really responded to that, and we'll say thank you now. So thank you to all of the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
So we will be restarting at